I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 46. Battle of Wadi Rim, 24th August 1990. 2nd Brigade, 82nd Airborne, Wadi Rim, Saudi Arabia. During the last 2 days of traveling across the brigade sector, Colonel Allen could feel the tension, fear, and excitement among his troopers for the coming battle. His paratroopers were ready. They were eager to get this fight going. Walking the company lines, Allen saw his soldiers constantly working on improving their fighting positions. Some were digging down, while others were improving the front or top protection of their machine gun bunkers. They knew this fight was going to be a slug match. They weren't going on the offensive. The enemy was coming at them, and they were going to do so in numbers they couldn't even fathom. What sucked about the terrain they were having to fight on was the soil and type of ground they had to work with. In most places, the ground was too hard to dig down more than a couple of feet. This meant there was a lot more emphasis on using sandbags to compensate. Each soldier and squad did the best they could with the cards they'd been dealt. The one major thing they had on their side was elevation. The enemy would have to assault their positions uphill. In addition to establishing their range cards for the crew-served weapons, they made sure to employ their Claymore anti-personnel mines properly. A Claymore is a remote command detonated anti-personnel mine. When it's fired, it acts like a shotgun, blasting some 700 eighth-inch steel balls up to 50 meters in front of it. These were considered a last-ditch weapon you fired when your position was about to be overrun. The only thing lacking was rolls of barbed and concertina wire. There just couldn't get any of it when they needed it. During the last few days, the volume of civilian traffic fleeing Medina was extraordinary. The civilians knew the Iraqis were coming, and they wanted nothing to do with them. Each vehicle passing through their lines was thoroughly checked to make sure they weren't inadvertently letting small elements of Iraqi soldiers from slipping into their rear area. Just the other day, they'd caught several vehicles with a bunch of men masquerading as women. Had he not had a cluster of female MPs to check them out, these would-be Iraqi soldiers might have slipped past them and gotten into his rear area. Having finally made some time to relax, Colonel Allen had been asleep for less than 2 hours when someone or something shook his foot. Colonel, wake up!" Captain Blumberg declared loudly. Allen was a light sleeper and had dropped off as soon as he'd lain down. It was a policy in the brigade that leaders would only be awoken when it was something important. Leaders tended to push themselves into sleep deprivation, which could lead to stupid mistakes. Everyone, leaders and soldiers, needed sleep if they were going to think clearly. "What is it, Captain?" "I'm awake," Allen said grumpily as he sat up and tossed his poncho liner off. Allen didn't take advantage of his rank. He maintained the same sleep conditions as his soldiers. He ate the same chow, slept in the same foxholes, and used the same shitty shower stations they did. He needed to know the physical condition of his soldiers before he sent them into a tough mission, and he couldn't know that if he didn't live like they did. "Sir, the ground surveillance radar team has picked up movement coming down the road from Medina. We think it might be a reconnaissance element from the 5th Division," Captain Blumberg said as he handed a steaming cup of coffee to the colonel. "1st Brigade lit up an Iraqi BTR-70 recon vehicle about an hour ago. They were apparently trying to scout Highway 340. Okay, be sure that the battalions understand they need to let the reconnaissance element pass through the area and not engage them. We want the Iraqis to feel safe in sending their units through this sector so they fall into our ambush. Got it?" Captain Blumberg nodded. He scribbled something down on his paper to handle it momentarily. Have we gotten any indications of the Iraqis deploying any biological or chemical weapons? The thought of WMD being released on them was the nightmare scenario no soldier wanted to face. Having to fight while weighed down in full mop gear and a gas mask was incredibly hard. Blumberg shook his head. No, sir. Our SIGINT guys at G2 said they've detected no chatter from the Iraqis about moving any of that stuff out of Iraq. According to the latest satellite and U-2 surveillance flights, the equipment and units responsible for deploying the rockets and artillery shells filled with the nasty stuff are still at their bases in Iraq. It's their assessment that the Iraqis aren't looking to employ any WMD, at least not at this point. Allen nodded. Makes sense. Why would they? They believe they're winning. No reason to turn the world against you when you're winning through conventional means. Okay, I'll be in the talk as soon as I drain my bladder. Have the FIST team meet me there. I want to be sure our artillery team is dialed in and ready to go. Also, make sure Captain Harrison from 21st Special Tactics Squadron is there as well. I suspect we'll see some Iraqi Cass and Hines coming at us today. Yes, sir, Captain Blumberg said before departing and heading to the talk. 325th Infantry Regiment. Sarge, we have company, PFC German said as he looked through the night vision sight on the Tau weapons system. The thermal images clearly showed the heat signatures of several vehicles approaching. German had recently been assigned gunner for the system, but had never fired a live round. In training, they'd fired on a simulator. Live missiles were expensive. The instructors had told them that the simulator was so good that they almost wouldn't be able to tell the difference. That was reassuring, but nothing substituted for the real thing. PFC German had been in the Army for almost 4 years. Normally, he'd be a specialist looking at possible promotion to sergeant, but he'd had a slight altercation with the MPs back at Fort Bragg. On more than one occasion, he'd managed to get busted down to PFC. The unit first sergeant had told him to just put Velcro under his rank because he put it on and took it off just as fast. German's position was on the south side of Wadi Rim, looking right up the road coming from Medina. His range of vision with the Tau's optics was roughly 5 clicks. His weapon could reach out 3 clicks. Sergeant Daly, his squad leader, crawled over to German and the weapon. "What you got?" Daly asked. "Looks to be a column of tanks and troop carriers. These aren't like that bunch we let roll through earlier. Those were recon dudes. These are heavies. I think this might be the start of the main body," German said. "Let me have a look," Sergeant Daly said. German moved out from the weapon and let Daly get behind it to look through the optics. After he studied the column for a few moments, Daly said, "You just might be right. I'm starting to see more vehicles show up." Daly eased back and reached for the TA-1 field phone. Cranking the handle, he waited for someone in the company TIOC to answer. "Sir, Sergeant Daly here. We have visitors, at least a company-size force of tanks and fighting vehicles approaching from Medina," he told the company commander. "Roger, sir. We'll wait for it to start. Out." "What did he say?" "He says to wait until the artillery starts landing. Then we're to join the fray and start taking those tanks out." The 2 assistant Tau operators were listening in. When the time came, it'd be their jobs to change out the spent missile case with a fresh one, so German could find and shoot another tank. "Remember, German, you get a better kill on the side of a tank than on the front. From what we've been told, the Iraqis are running T-72s. What we don't know is if they're equipped with reactive armor. If they are, then that'll make it a lot hard to kill them. We don't necessarily blow the tank up. Hitting the side hull or at least taking out a tread and boogie wheel will disable them. Also, if you see an air defense weapon, nail it. Those are to be prioritized even above tanks." 5 minutes later, at precisely 0437, the first artillery rounds sailed over their heads. It sounded like a freight train rushing through the air, making its own unique whooshing or screaming noise before the high-explosive projectile exploded in spectacular fashion among the enemy positions. The initial volley was only the 105 rounds. These were set for airburst to force the tank and armor commanders to button up, which would greatly reduce their visibility and impede their ability to react to what was coming next. The 105s were quickly followed by the heavier 155s, which were set to ground burst. 15 shells exploded together at about 200 feet above the Iraqi formation. The shrapnel from these rounds sheared off antennas, disabling communications in the tank formation. It also killed any tank commander or leader that wasn't buttoned up. Almost immediately from the north side of the wadi, the 1 to 325 battalions TOWs opened fire at their maximum range. "Start picking your targets, German, and engage," Sergeant Daly shouted over the roar of the battle. German fired at a tank he'd been tracking for a little while. Once the missile had ignited, he kept the targeting reticle aimed at the tank, guiding the missile right to it. The TOW fired at a range of 3,000 meters, which was a major factor considering that the T-72 weapon had an effective range of about 1,800 meters when firing the tungsten core rounds. The 125mm gun on the tank could fire much faster than the TOW, but the TOW's accuracy couldn't be matched. At the 3,000-meter range, it took the TOW missile about 10 seconds to reach its target. In that 10 seconds, the best the target could hope for was that they could move behind something or get out of sight before the missile impacted. German's target was not that fortunate, especially as he was in an elevated position, looking down on the open desert floor. "Reload!" Sergeant Daly yelled as another round was inserted into the launcher. "Target!" German shouted excitedly. He'd just blown up his first-ever tank. "Fire!" Daly commanded, and another round exploded from the launcher. From across the platoon in the 4 locations, missiles were streaking towards the armor formations. From 4 other locations, the other platoons of the company joined the action, sending their own missiles at the Iraqis. A total of 20 TOW launchers on the south side of the wadi were tearing into the Iraqi armor formations, with devastating effect on the enemy. The Iraqi vehicles tried deploying smoke screens in hopes of throwing the TOW missiles off and giving themselves some sort of concealing cover as they pressed home their attack. Unbeknownst to the Iraqis, the TOW system was equipped with a thermal optical system capable of seeing the heat signature of the enemy vehicles. The vehicles stood out as a red glow in the gunner's sight, given the heat difference at this early hour of the day. As the Iraqi tanks were being cut down, the missile operators turned their attention to the BMPs and the BTR-70s and BTR-80s rushing the Iraqi infantry into the battle. These were considered the real threats to the paratroopers, as they contained infantry soldiers that could dismount and attack on foot. Once the infantry dismounted, then the close-in fighting would begin. With so many wrecked and burning tanks and armored vehicles, the paratroopers heaved a sigh of relief. They'd succeeded in blunting the enemy advance. Now the battle would transition to an infantry fight, a fight that highly favored the Iraqis given their sheer numbers. This next part of the battle would get down and dirty as it became more personal. Colonel Allen had moved to the sounds of the guns and was in a position to observe the events firsthand as they unfolded. The eastern sky was starting to get light, and he knew once the sun was up, the intensity of the battle would increase as the Hindi helicopters and Su-25 Frogfoots started to show up. The enemy aircraft was a major concern of his. His brigade had air defense systems for incoming missiles and low-altitude aircraft, but they weren't sufficient to handle aircraft flying through canyons and hills. The Stinger missile system was okay, but wasn't sufficient in quantity or capability compared to the air defense systems the Iraqi army had. His TOWs had taken out a couple of ZSU-23-4 weapons systems, but several more were on the battlefield, and they were accompanied by SA-9 Gaskins and SA-6 system further in the formation. Every gunner knew they were priority targets, even more so than the T-72s. Allen watched as the first element of the Iraqi attack stopped and assumed hasty defensive positions. They were on the shoulders of the North Passage into Wadi Reem and the South Pass along the highway. The question was, which would the Iraqi commander attempt to breach through? When another formation of tanks showed up, Allen had his answer. They were going to move across the open ground and straight for the northern pass. That makes sense. It's the larger of the openings, with more maneuver room than sticking to the highway. They'll break through the 1 to 325th at that point and roll right into the kill zone. Colonel Allen turned to his engineering officer. George, lay in the FASCAM minefield. Next, he turned to his FIST officer. Dick, have the 155s lay in the minefield. The fire support officer, or FISCO, was the artillery's liaison officer embedded either with the tactical unit or at the brigade headquarters. The FISCO understood how to best use the artillery at their disposal and made sure the commanders did as well. Yes, sir, the engineer replied as he grabbed for the field phone to send the word down. His crews had spent the last 3 days placing MOPM FASCAM mines along Highway 15 to the south of Wadi Rim. Now they'd activate those mines. The infantry companies had also been instructed on how to activate their respective suitcase minefields they'd deployed with. Each suitcase contained 35 anti-personnel mines and 4 anti-tank mines. The 155mm Corps artillery would fire and place a brigade-designated minefield in the kill zone in front of Al-Ghazlan, effectively closing off the west end of Wadi Rim. In the haste to get ammunition to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the logistic planners had overlooked deploying the Air Force CBU-89B air-delivered mines in the initial force package. This entire responsibility had fallen on the shoulders of the artillery and the engineers for the time being. Colonel Allen watched the Iraqi units go to work. A couple of their own engineering units had opened up some of the shoulder areas along the highway, creating a passage for the tanks and other armored vehicles to move down into Wadi Rim, just as his own engineers and experts had said they would. When the first scout vehicles filtered into Wadi Rim, Allen saw his tactical air controller party rep radioing in for an airstrike. The Air Force was going to provide his brigade with A-10 support, while the Division Aviation Unit provided their Apache gunship support to the brigades to the north of him. Right on cue, as the Iraqi units moved more units into Wadi Rim and the different valleys and offshoots they could travel down, Allen's few units down there were making a big show of retreating. This was all part of their grand plan. They wanted the Iraqis to think they had the Americans on the ropes, so they'd press home their attack, both spreading their forces out and thinning out their air defense units' ability to be in all places at once. For the next 20 minutes, Colonel Allen and some of his staff sat in their concealed perched position and observed what the Iraqis were doing through telescopic lenses. It wouldn't be long now until the Air Force arrived to begin drawing out the Iraqi SAMs. Once they were satisfied they'd gotten the ones they could, the A-10s would swoop in and massacre the enemy tanks. "Sir, the Air Force is starting their attacks," one of his staff officers told him. Flashes of light leapt from launchers on the ground as missiles took to the air, streaking after the fighters. A squadron of F-4 Phantoms from Germany had arrived the other day in Egypt. The Phantoms were resuming an old role they had played in Vietnam, drawing out enemy SAMs and then engaging them with their AGM HARM missiles. Explosions rocked the area around the highway and further behind the Iraqi lines. Allen knew that was likely some of the SAMs exploding. The pre-dawn sky then lit up with AA and AAA tracer fire. The Iraqis must have brought in some towed gun support to protect their units. Somewhere high above them, the sounds of jet engines could be heard. While they couldn't see exactly what was going on, as it was still somewhat dark, they knew the Iraqis must have sent some fighters in their direction. Chances were the Phantoms, or maybe the Navy Tomcats, were engaging them. As the token American units fought a fighting retreat, the Iraqis pressed home their advantage, apparently oblivious to the trap they were rushing right into. Then the American A-10 Warthogs made their grand appearance. The first pair of them swooped in from the east, placing them in the sun as it rose above the ridges, blinding the defenders. Still having some range between themselves and the Iraqis, the pair of warthogs unleashed their 6 AGM-65 Mavericks at the T-72s. The air-to-ground missiles were the perfect anti-tank missile to use against the T-72, even if it had reactive armor on it. The precision-guided missile allowed the A-10s to wipe out 12 T-72s in their first pass. On the second pass, they made use of their 30 militons Ju-8A Avenger rotary cannon, shredding additional tanks and armored vehicles. The gun made a unique ripping sound when it was fired, the unmistakable sound of American firepower during a battle. The flight of 3 warthogs was thoroughly tearing the enemy apart. Then a missile streaked down from a higher altitude and rapidly closed the gap on 2 of them. Both aircraft started spitting out flares and taking evasive maneuvers. The missile went for one of the flares and detonated harmlessly behind the 2 planes. At this point, the 6 warthogs were scattering to the 4 corners. They were trying to get away from whatever was hunting. Colonel Allen was fascinated. He'd never seen an aerial battle take place like this. The way the fighters danced around in the sky while they dispensed flares and chaff canisters and missiles flew around them. Then a lone MiG-23 Flogger swooped in from higher altitude. It had set its sights on one of the warthogs as it closed the gap between them. It fired off another missile which closed the distance on the warthog, leaving it no time to react. The right engine of the plane exploded in flame. The A-10 seemed to have stabilized itself and was able to stay aloft. Allen was sure this must have ticked the MiG pilot off, as he probably thought he had a kill and wanted to go after another plane. The pilot must have switched over to his guns, as he'd really gotten in close to the crippled American plane. The space around the Warthog filled with 23mm tracer rounds. A string of them tore into the tail section of the A-10 and its remaining engine. Moments later, the pilot must have decided he'd had enough. He ejected in a position that would eventually land him over Allen's men. The MiG pilot had already pulled away and started chasing down another A-10. 2 of the warthogs had circled around and fired their own nose cannons at him. The MiG jinked to the right just as a streak of bullets flew right where he would have been. The Iraqi pilot who had just used his guns on the other plane fired off a short burst from his own guns. The 23mm rounds from the Iraqi MiG slammed into the cockpit and front section of the Warthog, flying right at him. The Iraqi plane pulled up and applied speed, while the American plane appeared to lose control and cartwheeled into the ground below. When the Iraqi pilot had turned around, 3 of the A-10s had already left the battle space. 1 A-10 had remained, determined to take this MiG out. He somehow managed to get a lock on him with his Sidewinder missile and fired. Just as the Sidewinder left the wing of the A-10, the MiG fired 2 missiles at the A-10. The Sidewinder connected with the MiG, forcing the pilot to eject. Then the pilot flying the Warthog ejected when both missiles from the MiG scored hits. Both pilots were now descending to the ground below. "Damn, sir, that was a hell of an aerial battle," commented one of Allen's staff officers. "Yeah, no joke. See if you can find out who that particular A-10 pilot is. He did a hell of a job battling that MiG. I'd like to make sure he gets some sort of medal for that." "Sir, it looks like another battalion, maybe 2, of mechanized infantry have entered Wadi Rim. They look to be heading right for our forces," the same staff officer informed him. "Send a message to the battalion commanders. They need to make sure their guys continue to hold fire. They cannot spring our trap until the Iraqis are fully inside the kill box," Allen ordered forcefully. "Yes, sir." The battle continued to unfold for another 30 minutes. The Iraqis eventually ran into the primary American defensive lines. When this happened, the battalions unleashed their TOWs. The wire-guided anti-tank missiles swooped down from their elevated positions and blew apart many of the remaining T-72s and BMPs. The Iraqi soldiers inside the BTRs started disgorging from their armored chariots. The infantry soldiers engaged with AK-47s and PKM machine guns at his soldiers' positions. It didn't take long for RPGs and grenades to be introduced into the fight. Artillery rounds were impacting along the ridgeline and the tops of the ridges from which the American positions had finally launched their ambush. The Iraqi 150mm rounds were ripping the area apart. The infantry below commenced to maneuver to engage the paratroopers while under the cover of the artillery. While the Iraqis appeared to be making their first major push, Iraqi ground attack planes entered the fray. "Those frogfooters have arrived. Where's my fighter cover?" shouted Colonel Allen as he looked at Captain Harrison, the Air Force TACP assigned to his brigade. "I'm already on it, sir. We've got 2 F-16s inbound right now. They're 5 mics out," the TACP replied, while holding a hand receiver to his shoulder. Allen nodded at the news. Maybe when the Air Force had learned they'd lost 3 A-10s to a single MiG, they'd decided to vector some fighters his way. In any case, he was glad they would be here soon. The first Su-25 swooped down like a German Stuka pilot as he unleashed a torrent of 80mm rockets across the bunkers, machine gun positions, and foxholes that dotted the ridge lines. When the first frogfooter pulled away to gain some altitude, one of his soldiers must have seen this as his opportunity. A single missile streaked up from the American lines and gave a quick chase after the Iraqi pilot. The missile exploded near the rear left engine, causing a short burst of flame and black smoke. The Iraqi plane didn't blow apart, and it didn't crash. Like its American cousin, the A-10 Warthog, it shrugged off the hit, having the ability to operate with just a single engine. The Iraqi plane did turn and head away from the battle space, though, so at least it wouldn't hit them with more rockets. That, of course, didn't discourage the other Su-25s. They swooped in, unleashing their own barrage of rockets. One of them made a decent strafing run across the American lines. More Iraqi soldiers joined the fray as they assaulted up the hill to get at the paratroopers. Fresh T-72s, BMPs, and BTRs continued to head towards this part of the fighting. They were acting like sharks when they smelled blood in the water. When the Iraqi planes appeared to be coming in for a third pass on the American lines, one of the frogfooters exploded in spectacular fashion. The pilot never saw what hit him. The fiery wreckage of the plane just fell to the ground. An F-16 Fight Falcon zipped across the American lines as if announcing to the soldiers below that help had arrived. The remaining Su-25s peeled off from their attacks and dropped to the deck while lighting up their afterburners. They were going to try and put some distance between themselves and the scene of the crime as they flew back to their base. Continuing to observe the battle, Colonel Allen figured they'd inflicted close to 70% casualties on the lead Iraqi brigade, the one that had charged forward and was currently engaged against his guys. The second Iraqi brigade looked like it had taken between 30% and 40% casualties. The third and final brigade of the Iraqi division was pushing forward to support their comrades in their own attack. It had finally come time to close the back door on this ambush they'd laid for this Iraqi division. Colonel Allen ordered his battalion on the ridge to fall back to their secondary positions. This would make the Iraqis believe they'd just broken through, leading the 2nd Brigade to dismount their infantry and spur on the 3rd Brigade to push around the wreckage of the first 2. While this was happening, a vehicle and anti-personnel minefield was being laid behind them. In addition to the minefield, elements from the 3rd of the 73rd Cavalry would help to close the gate behind them with their platoon of M551 Sheridans. They were backed up by the company team from the 24th Infantry Division. Once the gate was fully closed, the remaining 2 battalions of Allen's brigade would finally be unleashed, as would the rest of the division's artillery and the remaining A-10 Warthogs. It would now be a matter of how fast they could wipe the trapped division before help could arrive. As the artillery fire began to hit its peak, Captain Poggy made the call to his unit. "All Panthers elements, this is Panther 6. Engage, repeat, engage." Turning his attention to his own tank, he called, "Gunner, Sabot, 2 tanks, near tank first." Staff Sergeant Hernandez responded. Identified. Up, said Specialist Dawson, the tank's loader. Fire, Captain Poggi yelled. Staff Sergeant Hernandez squeezed the trigger, and the main gun recoiled with a deafening explosion. Any dust that had settled was now airborne as the tank rocked when the main gun fired. Staff Sergeant Hernandez was already aligning the gun for the second tank. Second tank identified, Staff Sergeant Hernandez shouted, as he had done so often in training. Specialist Dawson immediately indicated, up, having reloaded the main gun. Fire, Captain Poggi commanded, and the process repeated itself. All 4 M1 tanks were engaging the Iraqi rear echelon units as quickly as they could. They were going to surprise the hell out of the Iraqi units as they busted through their rear area. Lieutenant Kincaid, the platoon leader for the Bradleys, had done his homework. When he'd examined the firing positions they would move into on the order to engage, he had worked out range fans for each vehicle. All were assigned overlapping sectors of fire and given the priority of targets for both the TWs and the 25mm Bushmasters. The Bushmasters had a mix of ammunition, but mostly the M791 APDS T12, which could take out anything but the T-72. The question was how much ammo each vehicle had. A total of 900 rounds were in each vehicle. The main gun, the 25mm chain gun, had a maximum rate of fire of 300 rounds a minute. Knowing this limiting factor, Kincaid told his vehicle commanders to set the gun's cyclic rate of fire to 100 rounds per minute and to use controlled bursts when they did use the guns. When a Bradley's main guns were dry, the reload time and process weren't exactly conducive during a battle. It required them to turn the turret in a particular position and unfasten a few things inside the vehicle to get at the ammunition box for the gun, something the vehicle planners clearly hadn't taken into consideration when they designed this beast. The platoon's gunners were well trained and knew it only took a couple of rounds to knock out a soft-skinned target like an air defense weapon or a BTR-70. When Lieutenant Kincaid received the command to engage, he switched radios. All dog breath elements, move out and engage. I want some scalps on the table for dinner tonight. On that command, the 4 Bradley fighting vehicles, which had been situated on the north side of the wadi, left their concealed positions behind the small hills and moved the 200 meters to their previously planned and prepared firing positions. As Lieutenant Kincaid's vehicle moved forward into position, he was overwhelmed at the number of targets appearing in front of them. His gunner didn't hesitate in the least. This was like a wet dream for a gun crew. The first target his gunner found was a Division Level 1 priority target, a damn ZSU-23-4 that was sitting stationed on the right flank of a cluster of thin-skinned BTRs and ash and trash vehicles. No sooner had his gunner turned the ZSU into a flaming wreck than Lieutenant Kincaid released his first Tau missile. He'd found a T-72 that had paused its advance and was in the process of rotating its turret to engage one of his Bradleys. 10 seconds later, the turret of that tank was doing somersaults through the air from the impact of the missile detonating against the side of the tanks. In a T-72, the tank's ammunition was kept in a rotating jacket of sorts along the chassis and the turret. This allowed the autoloader to cycle in a new round after each shot or shift to a different section in the belt, depending on the type of round the commander wanted to fire. This system meant the ammunition was left completely exposed to whatever happened in the turret, often resulting in it exploding or cooking off from the slightest of hits. The defilade positions the Bradleys were firing from were well within range of the highway the Iraqis had been using to rush their forces forward. This gave Kincaid's vehicles an exceptional field of fire from which to tear the enemy force apart before they'd have to withdraw to their next position. From their hide positions, they also had a good view into the southern approach to the highway and the backs of the enemy units assaulting the paratroopers right now. Kincaid had his Bradley gunners concentrating their fire on enemy air defense systems as they found them, using the M242 Bushmaster 25mm chain gun. They'd also use the main guns on the BMPs, BTR-70s, and BTR-80s. For everything else, they'd wait and use their crew-served weapons. Kincaid made sure his vehicle commanders knew to save the TOWs for the tanks. Watching the tank rounds crisscross the distance between the two forces, Lieutenant Kincaid couldn't believe how effective the depleted uranium rounds of the M1 tanks were. They just devoured the T-72s, causing massive internal explosions with each hit. The M1s were taking advantage of their extended range over the T-72s as much as possible. Still, some of the T-72s had gotten within range and were sending rounds at the Americans. When they did score a hit against an Abrams, the round would ricochet right off. Either they were too far away, or they just couldn't muster the necessary kinetic energy to punch through the Chobham armor of the Abrams. The combination of the ground-mounted TOWs of the infantry and the M1 tanks with supporting Bradleys was brutally mauling the Iraqi formations, and they hadn't even wandered into the minefields the engineers had left for them. In the first 10 minutes of the brigade's ambush, more than half of the 78 tanks in the Iraqi division were smoldering ruins. It was quickly becoming a turkey shoot of what was left. Captain Bloomberg practically jumped out of his seat as he was talking on the radio. He grabbed for his gas mask like his life depended on it. The others in the brigade TOC took notice and started grabbing for theirs without needing to be told. With the damn thing on his face, he turned to look at Colonel Allen. "Sir, 2325 just reported a chemical attack. He believes it's mustard gas." Colonel Allen grabbed for his own mask and put it on. He hated wearing it, but being uncomfortable was better than being dead. Fucking G2. Way to blow that intelligence, Allen thought angrily to himself. He was going to chew their asses out when this was all said and done. How did they miss the deployment of the WMD from the Iraqi bases? They're under continuous surveillance. Notify the battalions, but let the commanders decide if they need to go to MOP 4. The wind is blowing towards the west, so that'll carry it away from most of our positions. Notify division, as they may get some residual, and notify the 8th Mech. Allen continued to watch the engagement areas, concerned about a breakthrough along Highway 15. If we only had more artillery, but we don't. I still can't believe those frog-footers damn near wiped out the corpse artillery, he thought, as he surveyed the situation. The 71st Tactical Fighter Squadron was doing their best to keep those Iraqi frog-footers off his soldiers. But damn if that South African artillery the Iraqis were using wasn't becoming an even bigger problem than the fighters. The rolling artillery barrages were taking a toll on his positions. Allen was on the radio with the squadron commander for the A-10s and the F-15s, desperately trying to get them more close air support. Hearing the sounds of jet fighters overhead, Allen looked up just in time to see a missile contrail from the ground eventually connect with one of the F-15s. A second later, the pilot ejected as the burning wreckage of his aircraft fell to the ground. The Iraqis had a pretty tight air defense system. Those SA-6s were really becoming a nuisance. "Sir, 3-325 is reporting some Hind Ds coming down Highway 15. He said they're flying too low for their stingers to get an effective lock on them," Captain Blumberg reported. "What about the Vulcans?" Allen asked with a raised voice. "They can't get a bead on them from where they're positioned," Blumberg called out. "Son of a bitch." Allen tried to come up with something to counter the Hind D attacks. If 325 fell, then Highway 15 would be opened. "Falcon 6, No Mercy 6, over," came over the radio. Who the hell is this now? Allen pondered. "No Mercy 6, Falcon 6, India, over," Captain Blumberg transmitted on the brigade command radio. "Falcon 6, India, No Mercy 6, flight of 12 Alpha Hotel 64. Understand you have targets for me, over." Colonel Allen grabbed the hand mic out of Captain Blumberg's hand. "No Mercy 6, this is Falcon 6 actual. We have Hind Ds hitting us in the south along Highway 15. Can you take them out? Over." Roger, Falcon 6. I have them in sight. We're moving to engage. Out. Although Allen couldn't clearly see the highway from his position, he could see the Iraqi Hinds racing down the road, strafing everything in sight. As they entered the gorge to the south that was the key bottleneck in the traffic flow, the Hinds began strafing the hillsides overlooking the road and punching off rockets. The Hinds were the kind of helicopters that liked to engage targets while flying. They seldom ever came to a hover to engage. However, the Apache helicopters normally attacked from a hover, and now they did so very effectively, firing 6 Hellfire missiles straight up the gorge. The Hinds had no place to hide and no time to react. The anti-tank laser-guided missiles slammed into the cockpits of each helicopter, causing a catastrophic explosion to take place. The burning wreckage of the giant helicopters fell to the ground below, further adding to the cauldron of death and destruction. Once they were destroyed, the Apache flight still had another 56 Hellfire missiles between them to go hunting. In short order, they tore the remaining vehicles of the division apart. Even the dismounted infantry was starting to feel the wrath of the 20mm chain guns on the Apache helicopters as the platoons made contact and started using them for direct platoon-level support. By mid-afternoon, the paratroopers started to see small white flags begin to appear as the Iraqi soldiers had decided they'd had enough. The Battle of Wadi Reem was over. Chapter 47. Degree of certainty. 22nd August 1990. USS Florida. Gulf of Oman. Con, sonar, the speaker in the control room announced. The tension in the control room was thick as they were practically on the bottom of the seafloor while they waited near the opening to the Strait of Hormuz. Sonar, what do you have, Simmons? The captain asked, perhaps a bit more tersely than he had intended. The open microphone system allowed those in the control room to speak normally in response to the sonar, communications, and battle management center without the use of a handheld microphone from the old days of diesel boats. The open microphone system could also be heard in the wardroom, CO's and XO's cabins, and the chief's quarters. Stay calm. Don't take your stress out on the men, Captain Fletcher chided himself. Sir, I believe we found us a way in. I'm tracking a slow, loud, clunky merchant ship heading towards the strait. I think we should go for this one, Captain, Petty Officer Simmons said confidently. Petty Officer First Class Simmons had been in the Navy for almost 10 years as a sonar operator. In Commander Fletcher's eyes, he was the best sonar operator in the Navy. He was months away from making Chief Petty Officer, and he would if Commander Fletcher had any say in the matter. Sonar, stand by. I'm on my way. XO has the con, Fletcher announced, and was acknowledged by the watch officer, the helmsman, and the quartermaster of the watch. The sonar room sat just forward and to the right of the control room. Almost immediately, Commander Fletcher was there. Commander Fletcher, skipper of the Florida, relished this position. This was his command, something he'd worked for his entire adult life to achieve. Better yet, he was in command during a war, a real, honest-to-goodness war. When he'd graduated the Naval Academy with a degree in nuclear engineering, he'd never thought he'd one day be in command of a guided missile submarine. At 6'2", he wasn't exactly the typical image of a submariner. It was during his first cruise that the skipper of the boat had told him to respect the men under your command, and in return, they'd respect you. Never treat them like they're beneath you, or just a stepping stone to your next promotion. You may command with the authority of the United States Navy, but having the respect and trust of the men below you will lead to a successful and gratifying command. Entering the doorway of the very crowded sonar room, Fletcher asked, Simmons, what you got for us? Simmons was the senior petty officer and the section chief. On the 10 waterfall displays on the bulkhead, Fletcher could see the sound waves of a ship's propellers. The 4 operators were focused on 2 screens each, and each display was focused on a certain type of processing. "Sir, I believe we have a Russian freighter. The beat and blade rate are that of a turbine drive freighter with a blade rate of 40 turns per minute. He's about 10,000 yards to the south of us and heading this way. It's a freighter, not a warship," Simmons explained. "You're sure it's a freighter, and not a warship?" Fletcher asked. A lot was riding on them getting this right. "Yes, sir. This ship only has a single screw. It doesn't match any of the known warships we have on record," Simmons explained confidently. "If I had to guess, I'd say he's a Soviet resupply ship headed to Kuwait or one of the other ports the Iraqis recently captured." "Good job, Simmons. Stay on this guy. See if you guys are able to identify any sea mines they may have planted on the seabed as well. If we do follow this guy through, I want you guys to do your best to plot a path for how we got in. We may need to follow that same path out or use it to lead others in. Got it?" "Aye, aye, Captain." "Okay, let me see what fire control says about this," Fletcher said as he turned and headed for the control room. "CO's in control," the helmsman announced as Fletcher entered and walked over to the fire control officer. "What do you make of this contact that Simmons has?" Fletcher asked. "Sir, it appears to be heading right for the entrance to the strait. The speed and direction are spot on for an entrance." Fletcher made his way over to the chief of the boat, Master Chief Jack Bridges, who was standing next to the plot table. Master Chief Bridges was a highly experienced submariner. He'd spent his entire Navy career serving in submarines. His first sub had actually been an old diesel boat before the fleet had converted to nuclear power. This would also be his last deployment in the silent service. He was retiring at the end of this cruise. Lieutenant Higgins arrived just then. He spotted the chief, who'd called him up here, and made his way over to the 2 of them. Lieutenant Higgins was the commander of SEAL Team 1 aboard the Florida. They had been in the Straits of Florida conducting training when the call had come to get to the Arabian Sea ASAP. As a result of the SALT II treaty signed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in 1979, the U.S. Navy had to remove 4 of its boomer subs from the fleet or convert them to non-nuclear missile boats. The Florida, an Ohio-class submarine, had her missiles removed and replaced with a pair of SEAL delivery vehicle systems located in dry dock shelters where some of her missile tubes used to be located. At periscope depth, SEAL team members would enter the dry dock shelters and then flood the shelters. Once flooded, the back hatch was opened and the team drove out. Although the original launch tubes remained aboard as they were an integral part of the boat suddenly had a lot of empty space. Some of the tubes contained Tomahawk cruise missiles, but others were used as storage space, and a couple were converted into showers, something appreciated by the crew. One converted launch tube was even used as the ship's barbershop. Some launch tubes had been converted into quarters to house up to 50 SEALs and some of their accompanying support elements. This initial shakedown cruise was meant to determine the feasibility of converting a few more of the boomers into SEAL delivery systems and special warfare platforms. They had no idea their maiden voyage would actually see them engaged in combat. When Lieutenant Higgins joined them at the plot table, Commander Fletcher brought him up to speed on the current situation. He told the SEAL commander they'd likely have a mission ready for them in the near future. "Captain," First Officer Turgenev called out, knocking on the ship captain's door. "Da, I am awake. Come in. What is it, Turgenev?" Captain Ivanov said, as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. As captain of the bulk carrier Kuzma Minin, he could sleep when he wanted. He had 3 underling officers of the Soviet Navy to watch things while he slept. Captain Ivanov had served in the Soviet Navy his entire military career. This was his first command, however, of a civilian ship, as it appeared to the American Navy. As such, he would not have to worry about being boarded by the American Navy unless something was seriously wrong. The American Navy would not suspect what his civilian vessel's cargo of machine parts really was. In fact, the entire crew of the Kuzma Minin were Soviet Navy sailors, though they wore civilian clothing. Some of his sailors, after being out of uniform for too long, were starting to behave too civilian for Ivanov's liking. They were losing their military bearings and starting to get into trouble. He'd have to address this when they returned to Murmansk. Their loose lips at a bar in Singapore a month ago had ended shore leave for everyone. A KGB officer had made sure of that. The rest of the crew was not making life easy for the three offenders. Not that Ivanov had a problem with that. At this rate, those three might not make it back to Murmansk. Sailors relished their shore leave. It was the one time these sailors got to see countries outside the Soviet Union and purchase Western goods, items that often sold for a small fortune when they returned to Mother Russia. Swinging his feet around and planting them on the floor as he sat up, Ivanov looked at his desk. "What time is it?" "Captain, it is 4:30. We are approaching the strait and the pilot boat is approaching with a pilot to take us through the minefields," Turgenev announced. "Okay, I am awake. I hope this pilot knows what the hell he is doing and speaks Russian. I am tired of having to struggle with the English that the Arabs speak, and I used to think the English that the British spoke was difficult. It is all English and they all speak it differently. How they understand each other is beyond me." Ivanov grumbled as he reached for his pants and then a shirt. "I will be on the bridge shortly after I freshen up and get some coffee. Give me 15 minutes. Oh, how soon until this pilot arrives?" "Probably 30 minutes." "Good. Slow the ship to 5 knots so he can climb up. I don't want the fool falling into the ocean. What are the seas like right now?" "Fairly calm with a moonless night. Maybe half a meter at best. Temperature is 30 degrees Celsius." "Good. Please tell the steward to bring me some coffee and I will be right up," Ivanov said as he dismissed Turgenev. "Khan," Simmons said over the mic. "Sonar, what you got, Simmons?" Captain Fletcher asked. "Khan, a second boat is approaching the target. High-speed screws estimate 30 knots. I suspect it may be the pilot boat," Simmons said as Captain Fletcher walked into the CIC. He had been in the wardroom having breakfast. Looking up, Fletcher saw a look of concern on Cobb's face as he stood at the ship control party, serving as chief of the watch. "Sonar has a second boat approaching the target. He thinks it might be a pilot boat." "Sonar, range to target?" Fletcher asked. "Khan, range is 2,000 yards. Glancing at the clock, Fletcher saw the officer on deck, or OOD. "Mr. Whitlock, proceed to periscope depth," Fletcher directed. Mr. Whitlock was also the assistant navigation officer. "Proceed to periscope depth, aye, sir." Fletcher turned to the dive officer of the watch, or DOW. "Dive, make your depth 60 feet. "Make my depth 60 feet, aye, sir. Full rise, both planes. Give me 15 degrees up. Chief of the watch, flood auxiliaries." Chief Bridges stepped over to the stern plainsman, and the helmsman tossed Fairwater, plainsman. "Take us up to 60 feet, 15 degrees up on the bow. Heading 360 degrees, reduce speed to 3 knots. Let's take this nice and easy." Slowly the crew began to feel the rise in the bow as the Florida angled upward towards the surface from the 700-foot depth she had been sitting at. "Sonar," Mr. Whitlock called out. "Khan, sonar." "Report all contacts," Whitlock requested. "Khan, the closest thing to us aside from the target is about 20,000 yards behind us and moving at a speed of 12 knots. It's believed to be another freighter. We've designated it as Sierra 2. "Roger, keep us posted." Turning to the OOD, Fletcher said, "Mr. Whitlock, when we level off, I want you to eye the target and tell me what you see. I want to know when the pilot is aboard, and I want you to start paying special attention to exactly what speed he has the ship travel and where he has them make turns. We need to do our best to annotate everything that pilot has the freighter do from here on out. Is that understood?" "Aye, aye, Captain," Mr. Whitlock responded with a grin. Mr. Whitlock was a fellow Academy graduate, and Fletcher felt it was an unspoken duty of his to groom and mentor this young man, just as he had been mentored by his first commander, who had likewise been an Academy ring knocker. Lieutenant Whitlock, serving as the OOD, was responsible for bringing the boat to periscope depth, and he was required to be on the scope at all times. At least once a day, he was required to bring the boat to periscope depth when underway. The new Purvis system on the periscope would now allow everyone in the control and other stations to see what he was seeing, to include the crew's mess on the big screen monitored to our TV. Con, sonar, Master 1 is slowed to 5 knots. Sierra 2 now appears to be alongside Master 1. Con, sonar, good copy, Fletcher said aloud, knowing Whitlock would have heard him on the open mic system. Lieutenant Crawford worked the magnification on the periscope, which showed a clean image of the smaller vessel having come alongside the larger freighter. He zoomed in one more magnification level. This one gave them a real good glimpse of a lone figure scaling what appeared to be some sort of retractable ladder that had been dropped down to them. "Damn, these new magnifications are something else," Whitlock commented to no one in particular. "They sure as hell are," Fletcher said. Fletcher then turned to his SEAL commander. "Lieutenant Higgins, we're going to piggyback our way into the Gulf via this freighter. Once we're inside the Gulf, I suspect we're going to receive some new orders from 5th Fleet. We'll keep you apprised of what happens. In the meantime, I'd keep your team ready to execute whatever may come our way." Lieutenant Higgins nodded in approval as a wide grin spread across his face. "Yes, sir. My guys are ready for whatever the brass wants us to execute." "Steady as it goes on this heading," the Iranian pilot said, as the ship cleared the last of the minefields. At this point, the sun had started a slow descent in the western sky behind the mountains of Oman. The pilot turned to Captain Ivanov. "I was told to take you into Soccerport. You'll be offloading your cargo there." "That is correct. My orders are to offload and then depart immediately. If you have a crew standing by, as I was told you would, we should be out of there by morning. Will you be taking us back out?" Captain Ivanov asked. The pilot shook his head. "No. Another pilot will handle your exit." The pilot looked at his watch briefly before he returned his attention to Ivanov. "We should be dockside in a couple of hours. Once we near the port, a couple of tugs will be standing by to assist you the rest of the way in." Ivanov was impatient. He wanted to offload his equipment and get out of this war zone as quickly as he could. One didn't survive this many years in the Soviet Navy by placing oneself in any more danger than one had to. Wanting to see if he could glean some intelligence from their Iranian pilot, Ivanov asked, "I understand the Americans have launched airstrikes against military targets in the area. Have they launched any attacks against the ports or commercial ships delivering supplies?" The pilot shook his head as he lit another cigarette. "There have been attacks, yes, but so far they have only been against military targets, and only in Saudi Arabia. So far the infidels have not carried out any attacks inside the UAE or against civilian targets or ships at any of the ports." Ivanov snorted at the comment. He pulled a cigarette out of his breast pocket and held it in his mouth. He motioned for the pilot to lean forward so Ivanov could light his cigarette off his. "Well, that may be true, but I do not want to be in these waters when that changes. Mark my words, if Saddam does not return your armies to your borders, or at least to Kuwait's borders, all hell is going to be unleashed on you guys." As we approached the strait, we saw several American warships, to include one of their aircraft carriers, taking up station in the Gulf of Oman. The Iraqi pilot seemed a bit concerned by this information. He didn't appear to know a lot of what was going on around him, other than what limited information he was being given. Clearing his throat, the Iranian finally replied, "The Americans will not follow you into the Arabian Gulf. Of that I am sure. The minefields are not known to them, and the water depth is too shallow for them to risk it. The deepest point in the Gulf is only 295 feet deep, and it's along the Iranian coast. The depths around Sakr are only 34 meters." Ivanov lifted an eyebrow at that information. He hadn't personally made many port calls in the Arabian Gulf. "How are the port facilities at Sakr where we are headed?" "The docking facilities are adequate. There are several berths with heavy-lift cranes that will be able to remove your machine parts quickly. I believe there is a company representative that will meet you when you arrive, along with a customs officer. Not that they will give you any problems, of course, the pilot explained. Looking at the pilot, Ivanov thought, this fool has no idea what our cargo is or who we really are. I am sure the company representative will meet us along with proper government official, Ivanov said, as he turned to find Turgenev. Mr. Turgenev, check that all preparations for docking have been completed and are in order, Captain Ivanov directed. As you wish, Captain, Turgenev replied with a slight grin on his face as he left the bridge. He was trying to stifle a laugh at their Iraqi pilots' complete obliviousness to who they truly were and what they were delivering to his government. Up scope, Mr. Whitlock stated confidently. 80 feet, level on the bubble, 10 knots, the duo indicated calmly. As the scope came up, Mr. Whitlock positioned himself in front of the monitor. When the periscope broke the surface, using the game-like controller in his hand, he quickly rotated the periscope a full 360 degrees to ensure there were no vessels in close proximity. No close contacts, he announced as he completed the scan. Since there were no close contacts, the scope would remain up and continue to execute a 360 scan. The ship they had followed through the minefield was seen moving away from them towards the port of Sakr. Mr. Whitlock, what was the name of that ship? Fletcher asked. From their vantage point, they could see the pilot boat, Sierra 2, departing the bulk freighter, Master 1, now that the freighter was under the guidance of a couple of tugboats from the harbor. Captain, Master 1 has been positively identified as Kuzma Minin, a bulk freighter home-ported out of Murmansk, their intelligence officer said. Thank you. I guess we wait and see what the brass wants us to do next, Fletcher replied. Now that their sub had made it into the Arabian Gulf, it was a matter of watching and waiting to see what the Fifth Fleet would have them do next. They'd managed to make it in. Now the question was, what would the brass do with them next? They didn't have long to wait. Florida's XO, Mr. Warren, entered control with the TS binder in hand. Any classified message traffic would be logged in and placed in the TS binder. Only those with a need to know would be able to see the contents of the message. Excuse me, sir, we have a message from ComNavCentcom, Mr. Warren said as he handed the TS binder to the captain. All eyes turned to the captain, who kept his calm demeanor as he read the message. From ComNavCentcom to USS Florida. Subject, mission tasking. RMKS, proceed to vicinity Sakr Port, UAE. Russian ship Kuzma Minin is believed to be carrying Scud missiles with potential Soviet WMD warheads, or capable of carrying Iraq-made WMD warheads. These missiles and their launchers cannot be allowed to be transferred to Iraqi forces. You are hereby ordered to sink the Kuzma Minin. The USS Florida should then stand by for further orders, to include the possible deployment of the embarked SEAL team for deep reconnaissance operations. No one on the con spoke for a moment. There was a lot to take in with that message. Captain Fletcher turned to his XO. Report Master 1. The contact manager looked up at the Big One fire control systems. Master 1 bears 270, range 10,000 yards. What he was trying to determine was whether they could get a torpedo shot off and still hit it, or whether the ship had already made the turn around the piers to get inside the port. He looked up at the captain. Master 1 appears to be inside the harbor. Damn. Okay, XO, muster the War Council in the BMC. Make sure Higgins is there, Captain Fletcher said. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Higgins, the SEAL team commander, joined the CO, XO, intel officer, and department heads in the Battle Management Center to review the options. You called? He said with a mischievous grin on his face. He knew a mission was in the offing. Looking at the frogman, Fletcher explained the situation. The tugs escorting the Kuzma Minin would have the ship around the elbow in the port soon, which meant launching a torpedo was out of the question. There wasn't enough time for the torpedo to travel the distance and hit the ship before they turned the corner. The way the port was set up, it had a single entrance that led into a U-shaped design. This particular port wasn't a large one. It was designed to offload large shipping containers of construction materials and get them loaded onto either flatbed trucks or freight cars to be moved across the country via rail. Lieutenant Higgins looked at the port, and then the depth chart surrounding it and leading up to it. It was shallow waters, 40 to 60 feet across most of it. Too shallow for the Florida to get them much closer than they already were. Fletcher said, "I think this might be a good situation to test the deployment of your SDVs. What do you think?" The frogman turned to Fletcher. "I was just about to suggest that. What better way to prove the concept than to use it in a real-world mission like this?" The Florida's original mission prior to the crisis in the Gulf was to test the concept of converting the original missile tubes into something new. Of the 24 tubes, 2 had been converted into lockout chamber for the SEALs, while the other 20 had been fitted with a reusable canister holding 7 Tomahawk missiles. If the system worked, then the Navy would move forward with the multi-billion-dollar conversion of the Ohio, Michigan, Florida, and Georgia into SSGNs. "How long until your team can be ready to deploy? We need that ship destroyed before they're able to offload those missiles," Fletcher said urgently. The frogman looked up at the ceiling above them, likely trying to think about the problem before responding. "If we're in position to launch right now, it takes 2 hours to get the SDV loaded up and flood the dry dock shelter, and we should be ready to go. Judging by the distance to the target and the speed of our SDV, 4 knots, I estimate it'll take us roughly an hour to reach the ship. Then another 20 or so minutes to set the mines, and then another hour to get back to the sub, 20 more minutes to get everything loaded back up into the lockout chamber. All told, I think we can deploy, travel and sink that ship and be back on board in, say, 6 hours." Fletcher looked at his XO and the Cobb. Depending on how fast the Iraqis moved at offloading that freighter, that might be enough time. Then again, they didn't have a lot of options. "Okay, Lieutenant, it's your show now. Get your team deployed and sink that ship. We'll move to deeper water and wait. Rendezvous back here in 6 hours." Lieutenant Higgins locked the door in the chamber, sealing them in. Once it was sealed, the red light near the door turned green. This sent a message to the hangar supervisor behind the plexiglass wall in the chamber, and to those on the con, letting them know they could start to vent and flood the chamber. Looking at the 3 other operators in the tube with him, Higgins gave them each a thumbs up and waited for each of them to give him one back. The 2 drivers for the SDV gave him a thumbs up as well. Then the water started to come in. It came in slowly, replacing the air in the chamber until the entire chamber was filled. The divers moved to the outer hangar door, located at the rear of the dry dock. Once the chamber was opened up, the SDV was slowly moved out of the chamber and made ready. As the pilot climbed on and his co-pilot got settled in, the 4 other SEALs got in. Each SEAL attached themselves to the onboard air system to conserve their own supply, and then they were off. Traveling at a speed of just 4 nautical miles, it was going to take them an hour and 10 minutes to travel the 5 miles to get themselves positioned inside the port. It was dark as the Kuzma Minin was slowly positioned along the outer dock of the port. The 2 tugs had done a good job of maneuvering them into position. As they entered the port itself, the ship was bathed in light by the massive floodlights that dominated the port and the cranes next to the docking ports. Looking out the window of the bridge in the direction of the cranes, Captain Ivanov felt his blood pressure rise. The area below the cranes was empty. There should have been a small convoy of flatbed trucks ready to receive his cargo. Instead, no one was there. 20 minutes later, the ship was finally tied off, and the gangway moved into place. Captain Ivanov was there, waiting to greet the port manager and start questioning him about where the truck drivers were at. "Captain Ivanov, welcome to the United Arab Emirates. My name is Mohammed." "Of course his name is Mohammed. Everyone in the Middle East is named Mohammed. I have a couple of vans that will be here momentarily to take you and your crew to a nearby hotel where you can freshen up or grab something to eat," the port representative said, rather cheerfully considering the early hour of the morning. "Excuse me, Mohammed. I was told when my ship came into port, the dock workers would be standing by to begin offloading our cargo immediately. Why are no workers present?" Mohammed bunched his eyebrows at the question before replying, "What do you mean?" Ivanov wasn't sure if his poor English wasn't being understood by this Arab whose English was also poor, or if there had been a miscommunication about what would happen once his ship came into port. Taking a deep breath in so as not to lose his temper, Ivanov countered, "Mr. Mohammed, perhaps you are not aware of what my ship is transporting, but it is vitally important that my cargo be immediately offloaded. The Soviet Union is taking a great risk in bringing this cargo to your country. It needs to be offloaded and dispersed now." The Arab looked a bit confused by what Ivanov had just said. He pulled a radio out of his back pocket and jabbered away in Arabic for a couple of seconds. Looking back at Ivanov, he said, "My apologies, Captain. My supervisor informed me there must have been a mistake. Our dock crew is not due back at work until 8 in the morning. My supervisor said the Army will send some people over here to begin offloading your cargo. Someone should be here soon to talk with you." Shaking his head, Ivanov turned around and returned to the bridge of his ship. If this was any port in Europe, the Americas, or Asia, a crew would already be here. Only in the Middle East do they not run a 24-hour operation. Approaching the port entrance, Lieutenant Higgins couldn't believe how much light was piercing its way down to their position. They were hugging the ocean floor, around 42 feet in depth, and still the area around them was a lot lighter than it should have been. If the water truly was this clear, then he was certain they'd be spotted by a halfway attentive guard during the daylight hours. As it was nearly 3 in the morning. The pilot steering them pointed in the direction of their target, the Soviet freighter Kuzma Minin. He nodded and gave the pilot the universal thumbs up. As they approached the large freighter, the SDV slowed until it came to a stop somewhere near the middle of the freighter. Lieutenant Higgins motioned for his team to get to work. They didn't want to be down here any longer than they needed to be. They needed to place a couple of limpet mines on the belly of the freighter in strategic positions they knew would cause it to sink. Just to make sure, they placed a couple of extra mines for added effort. When the SEALs had placed their limpet mines on the Kuzma Minin, they climbed aboard the SDV and made their way over to the only other ship in port. They had no idea what nation it belonged to, but if they wanted to make this little impromptu plan work, it had to join Davy Jones's locker with the Kuzma Minin. Looking at his watch, Higgins saw they'd been in the harbor for nearly 60 minutes. They were running late, and they needed to get out of there. It was now a little past 0400 hours. They still had another hour back to the Florida, and a bit of time to get the SDV positioned back in the lockout chamber. The sun would be up around 7 in the morning. They'd be cutting it close as they tried to get back to deeper water, where they could hide. Captain Ivanov looked at the minibus as it pulled up to the dock. When it stopped, half a dozen workers got out and started climbing up the massive cranes anchored next to his ship. A handful of the workers boarded his ship and made their way over to the deck. His crew worked with them, getting the tarps removed and the containers with the missiles in them ready to be moved. Looking at his watch, Ivanov was ticked at how slowly these Arabs moved. His ship had been tied up in port now for nearly 3 hours, and they were only just now sending a crew to unload his ship. He was going to have a nasty conversation with the port manager once the missiles had been offloaded. The longer he was in port, the higher the risk of being discovered. With the war going, he'd bet his pension the Americans had every ship and port being watched by satellites to spot weapons being brought in to help the Iraqis. No sooner had he thought about the Americans discovering what he was carrying than the ship across the harbor from his own exploded. At first, the ship rose slightly out of the water. Then it was enveloped in flames as a series of explosions overtook the entire thing. Seconds later, Ivanov felt something rumble under his own ship. In the blink of an eye, he was thrown to the ground, a sharp pain washing over his body as a searing flash of heat and flame seemed to consume and melt everything around him. His brain didn't even have time to register the explosions that rippled across his ship as the Scud missiles added their own explosive power to the limpet mines. Lieutenant Higgins looked at his watch. The only sign that the mines had gone off was the sound of some distant explosions in the water. They had just slid the SDV into the dry dock shelter on the Florida when they'd heard the first of a series of explosions. Knowing they needed to get the hell out of there, Higgins didn't bother sticking around any longer than necessary. Once the outer hangar door was shut and dogged, draining and pressure equalization commenced. When the pressurization was completed, Higgins opened the hatch that'd allow them back into the Florida, where he was greeted by the chief of the boat and Commander Fletcher. They were there to congratulate him on a successful mission. The sonar room had reported the destruction of the ship. While Higgins and his men would now work on cleaning their gear and grabbing some hot chow and a fresh shower, the skipper would work on getting the boat moved to deeper water and going into hiding. They'd establish a routine for checking in for new orders. But other than that, their primary objective at this point was to do their best to disappear and pretend they didn't exist.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.